Septimus, a First Latin Reader, by R.L. Chambers and K.D. Robinson. Illustrations by C.J. McCall. Voiced by Carla Shodder. First published 1936. Prologue. How it all began. Septimus had spent a long time in the museum, and he was tired. He had been looking around at all the exhibits that had to do with ancient Rome, and like many other people, he found a great interest in what was very old. Many of these Roman things had existed for at least 2,000 years. The thought almost made him hold his breath, for fear that at last they should crumble away and fall into dust. But besides the simple fact that they were old, he had another interest in them. It had occurred to him suddenly, when he had been looking around for a time, that he knew something about some of these things. It was not very often, he thought, that the things they had to learn about in school turned up in real life. But here was an exception to that rule, for now he was looking with his own eyes at some of the very things that he had read of in his Latin books. Here were actual objects that the Romans had seen and thought about and made 2,000 and more years ago. It made the Romans and their language much more real to him. Amongst other things, he could see statues and busts of some of the actual men whose names he had come across in his Latin books. Before today, he had sometimes thought that they did not belong to the real world. They had lived so long ago that you could not really think of them as having existed at all, as thinking and talking and fighting and working and playing as the Latin books said they did. But there they were, a whole row of Roman heads looking straight in front of them from their shelf on the wall opposite to him. Several times, as his gaze wandered round over the showcases and exhibits in the big room, it seemed almost as though they caught his eye, and he had to look twice to make sure that they were not watching him. They were the people who had once spoken Latin and governed the world, and left behind them books that people had loved and preserved carefully, and that were always sure to find someone who liked to read them. People said that Latin was a dead language because it was not in general use anymore, but it had lasted, and still it lasted in spite of that. Those Romans were dead too, a long time ago, but it made them seem none the less real when you remembered all the things they had done, and could see so many things that they had made, and especially when you looked at the line of heads on the opposite wall. Septimus looked at them closely now. There was Julius Caesar, for instance. He seemed much more real at this moment than Septimus's own uncle Julius, who was supposed to be calling for him at the museum at 3:30. He must be late, because Septimus had come here at 2 o'clock, and that seemed much more than an hour and a half ago. He had no watch with him. That was the worst of trying to mend things yourself. He could have gone to look for a clock, but he was very comfortable sitting here, looking at the old Roman heads which still appeared so much alive. It seemed almost as if they might be talking to each other. Perhaps even about him, the moment he took his eyes off them. But he could not catch them at it, however quickly he turned back to them, and he began to feel a little uncomfortable. There was no one else in the room, and he was sure the Roman heads were watching him. Some of them looked none too pleasant, he thought. Julius Caesar was all right, in spite of his sternness. A glance would tell you that he was a very great man, but that you need not be afraid. He had the distant sort of expression that people have who rarely bother to be unkind. But there was a fat-faced one, the Emperor Nero, who had a nasty look about him, boastful and sly and cruel. Septimus did not think he would care to meet him when there was no one else in sight, and he looked round apprehensively. He was still alone in the big room. But it was ridiculous to think of meeting any of them. He smiled to himself at the thought of coming across Nero on the top of a bus, in his robes and his laurel wreath and with his fiddle under his arm. Septimus vaguely remembered a story about Nero fiddling while Rome burned, but it was too much of an effort to recall the details. Thinking about Nero and how unpleasant he must have been, Septimus turned lazily to have another look at him. Then he had a great shock. He was certain that one of the heads had moved, the one at the end of the row. There it was again, flinching his shoulder up exactly as if it felt a draught, and glancing round as if it wanted to discover where it came from. Septimus was so amazed that he automatically looked in the same direction himself, and there, sure enough, was a door, a little way ajar in the corner. Curious, he thought, that he had not noticed it before. Perhaps that was due to his drowsiness. But the really odd thing was that through the crack of the open door a strange light seemed to be coming. It was not electric light. It was too yellow for that. It was more like sunlight, and stronger sunlight than he had ever seen in his life. That was particularly curious because when he came into the museum, the streets had been cold and dull under November rain. Septimus got up from his comfortable seat and went across to investigate. He pushed the door wide open, and what he saw before him then made him cry out aloud in astonishment. "Oedipal," he said.